everybody, and welcome back to the Survivor 50 Wishlist podcast, an off-season series where we're trying to figure out who could and should come back for Survivor 50. My name is Mike Bloom, and we are discussing the final new player season of the quote-unquote old era of Survivor, though a little bit with an asterisk considering that it is a new player season, but there are a couple of veterans involved that are not players. We are talking Survivor 39, Island of the Idols, and we certainly have a lot to get into with regards to the cast and the season overall. Of course, I'm Mike Bloom. I am not alone. I am joined by someone who I would ordinarily say Beth Dixon and her giant head are here, but that feels so odd out of context, Beth, that I don't want to insult you for people who don't remember what the context is of this season.
First of all, I know I have a big head anyway, because I am a Leo. I don't know if you share this with me, Mike, as a fellow Leo, that
That's
sometimes
true.
we can get a little big-headed. And also the other part of me is like, ooh, I would love to have a statue head of me somewhere. So I guess I am just leaning into that energy.
Define somewhere. Would you want it to be like in your personal possession, or would you just want it to be like a landmark somewhere?
I want it to be a landmark in a place that makes absolutely no sense, so people are constantly Googling it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Or like
Yes.
they'll set up like Pokemon Go catch stations there.
That's the dream. I want a gym on my face. Okay, I don't know if I thought that through before I said it.
You know what? It's perfect. It's incredible, Beth. I adore you so much.
God.
And I enjoy any excuse to talk with you,
Same.
including about Survivor. So, Island of the Idols.
Yes.
Look, some fans might regard this, and certainly this was the case back during 2020 when RHAP did its fan rankings of the season, as one of the least regarded seasons in Survivor history. I think the large reason is, of course, the sexual harassment incident conducted by Dan Spilo that's spilled over throughout the pre-merge and post-merge, made headlines, led to, the only case so far of someone actually being removed from the game due to a break in the code of conduct, inspired mass controversy, headlines, and an actual change to the HR policies behind the scenes when it comes to the contact that can be accorded out on the island moving forward. And so very understandably, people are like, kill this with fire, do not necessarily want to talk about or approach this season again. On top of that, I think your mileage may vary as to the fact that, again, you bring in this wild twist of Rob and Sandra living out on an island, and occasionally new players will visit them and go to like Survivor school for a brief period of time where they're going to teach them how to do something and maybe give them an advantage along the way, which then brought, I believe, the most idols into the game in Survivor history so far, because we had regular idols you could find at camp. We had idols that you could grab for 1, 2, 3 tribal councils, idols that you could go for and eventually lost your vote on. So suffice it to say, there are a good amount of things that people do not like about this season. The question I have for you, Beth, is that we have talked throughout this process about how, looking back at the casting of returnees seasons, Survivor has sometimes kind of shirked, not Wanda, but sort of cast a blind eye to a bunch of seasons that maybe they'll bring 1 or 2 people back, but if production themselves did not have a good experience casting from them, then it's not necessarily a season that they would revisit in terms of a pool of possible returnees. You look at Thailand, you look at Gabon, you look at the OG Survivor Fiji. Hell, you even look at something like Marquesas, which was not an enjoyable season to film from a production perspective, but we've only seen Boston Rob and Kathy back. The big question is, and especially given the climate today that, again, really fed into this absolute fire that rained down upon the show, understandably so, back in season 39, if the producers are looking to cast season 50, do we realistically think that this is a cast they will actually look to pick people from, or is this a, like, stove that they do not want to necessarily touch at all or acknowledge?
I really think that this is a cast where they're going to look at it and say, it's like the Hunger Games, we can reap like 1 person from this cast. I really feel like, and I I'm going to have an inner battle when I talk about this cast a little bit, just to like put it all out there. And I think that production is going to be having the same issue, which is, do we want to bring people back because they deserve a second chance given the outside things that happened in the game? Or in how they reacted to them and how they didn't react to them, how they played into it or how they didn't play into it. And is that a reason enough to bring someone back for 50? On the other side of that coin, the other part of me is like, that shouldn't be the only reason. Like, you should want it. And like, when you're thinking about tokenism in a sense, when you're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, like, you don't want to bring someone back because of an incident. You want to bring somebody back because they are a worthy player. They're a character that people want to watch. They would make good television. And if production is thinking that way, this cast is actually really rich with quite a few people that would be excellent for this. So if they can get past the idea of like, hey, yeah, there's a lot of really disappointing characters that came from this season, and that surrounded the Dan controversies and issues. But there's also a lot of really interesting characters. And some of them, I worry that when they get brought back, they could have a completely different narrative that the fans, especially probably more casual fans, and production may be trying to like face. And I would much rather have them come back because of who they are and what they can bring to the game. So I think that that's just like, to put it all out there before we even talk about this cast. I think it's important to realize, like, I don't think production is going to come like, well, we got to give, Kellee, for example, a chance to come back because we have to. And it's like, no. You don't have to bring Kellee back because of everything that happened with her. But you should want to bring Kellee back because of how amazing she is as a character and a player. Like, that's where I don't know how production will think of it. I think they'll probably err on the former, because that's just what I've come to expect from quite a few productions. But that's where I think, I don't know.
It's a little unfair to throw out the baby with the bathwater here. And I do think, especially as we're going to get into, this group that goes out towards the end game, there are some really fun characters. There are some really brazen players. And I think that this could be an opportunity, especially given the fact that, those of us, you included, Beth, who want to see 50 be a second chance. Yeah. This is an opportunity for these kind of people to also remind us, like, hey, don't necessarily lump me in with all the stuff that went down in my first season. If you try to separate kind of the player from the season, there are potentials that you could definitely pick out of this group of 20.
Oh, for sure. I just genuinely feel like when you look at the notes of the season, or if you go back to watch it, there's some really interesting strategic minds. There's some characters who really never got a chance to really play the game because they were pigeonholed in certain positions. And there's a lot of people from this cast who have been very active in the Survivor community and the RHAP community, and are people that we see faces and see them interacting with Survivor in the community now. And I honestly think that should have something to do with it, to be quite frank. If you're thinking of production, you should have people in mind that those who are your most fervent supporters are seeing on social media and being active and having commentary. There are people who are showing up to events. There are people who are good, outstanding citizens of the Survivor community, so to say. And in addition to all the wonderful things they bring in to the game and as a television entertainment character. So I do think if you're production and you're trying to think strategically, this is not a cast to overlook, even though of its position within the seasons and the controversies that happen with it.
All right. Well, you talk about those that are affluent members of the Survivor community when it comes to their social cachet. But, I mean, as we start admittedly with our final three, maybe that wasn't necessarily the case here. So we have our winner in Tommy. We have our second place finisher in Dean. And then this season's 0 vote finalist, the self-proclaimed peacock herself, in Nora. So let's start with Tommy, because Tommy was in a group that was full of, again, all these big, colorful characters. I think even he would admit was not necessarily on that side. And maybe part of it was, again, to sanitize the quote unquote winner edit of it all, to make him seem just overall just a neutralized character so that he'll be sort of palatable to everybody. Maybe it's because Dan seemingly was one of his closest allies and someone that was in his endgame plans, and so they kind of wanted to separate him from that narrative as much as possible. Or maybe it was due to the fact that something that I honestly low-key love about Tommy's game is that he had nothing to do with the theme of the season.
Nothing.
Yeah, this was a season that, again, had pretty much every episode someone going to an island where Rob and Sandra would teach them a lesson about Survivor and most likely give them an idol or an advantage. Tommy never had an idol, never had an advantage, never even won individual immunity, the first player to win and do that since Natalie White, but never even saw Rob and Sandra, basically, until the end. Or no, I don't think, because Rob and Sandra had that little moment where they like said goodbye to their place and left it. So Tommy never interacted with the two Survivor mentors and is one of the only people in the season not to do so. And there is a part of me that kind of loves that ironic meta at the end of this season that threw the most idols into the game, that had, again, was sort of captained by these two absolute forces of the show, leading people along and trying to see what happens in each and every tribal council, that the guy who took it all in the end, who sat on the 39th throne here, is somebody who had nothing to do with that and just played a solid social game the entire time.
That is what I think is really interesting about this cast, is that you have somebody who really dominated pretty socially, but it's because they weren't necessarily a strong character in a cast of strong characters. It kind of harkens back to me to an old school Survivor game. This is somebody who took advantage of the social bonds that he had and was able to maneuver the game. And I argue that a lot of the moves that he made could be replicated with other people. If you're looking at like Lauren, for example, that we'll get to later, I think that he's just an interesting character, like you said, for the fact that he didn't fit the theme at all. And when you were talking about all the idols and such, I was like, maybe that's what they meant by Island of the Idols, was all the idols they threw into it rather than...
So that, I mean, listen, as someone who was out there, like that pretty much was the idea a little bit. And it's interesting then also comparing him to somebody like Dean, who did sort of represent the theme at its face, right? Who came into Final Tribal Council and had a confessional in the finale being like, I have the immunity necklace. I have this idol that I don't need to use. I have this fake legacy advantage that I don't think is fake. Mama, look at me now. And again, it was an interesting sort of repudiation of what Survivor was at that point in that final vote, where it's like, yeah, Dean, listen, you could rack up all the resume points that you want to, but at the end of the day, Tommy gave the better interview here.
For sure. And I think that this is the thing that when we look back and we're always trying to figure out like what makes a Survivor winner, you'll have the people who play the game. They're like, we have to get the physical threats out. And it's like, well, how many physical threats have actually won the game? When they sit down in Final Tribal Council, what else are they able to rely on? Right. There are a few, who have, I always think of Mike, for example, like, like won his way to the end. Right. But for the most part, it's so interesting when we think about modern Survivor with this idea of building a resume, when really this season kind of further proved, like, even with all the idols and advantages that you have, just because you maneuver the game with what production has in mind doesn't mean that the jury is going to respect that if you can't defend your game in any other way. So it's this, Dean kind of showed me and everybody else that it does not matter how many trinkets you get, how many things you add to your resume. If your resume does not match the job, which is Survivor winner, it will not get approved for an interview. Okay. It doesn't mean that it prepares you for the interview itself. So
what about his interview for detective? Did he pass the detective's exam?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think that he's somebody who I think people read him like a book. And I think that that's what's unfortunate for him. I do think that he was somebody who was underestimated in the game. And I don't think that he was able to overcome that in this. And what I mean by that is, like, I think that people saw him as a threat, but they didn't see him enough as a threat, even with all the trinkets and such that he had, to want to take him out. And
Mm.
someone like Tommy, you wanted to keep him because he was like the good old American teacher with a good personality and brought a little bit of something to everything. And Dean seemed to just be like the guy in show lights, right? Like you're like, oh, it's
Mm.
Dean, and then you look at Tom and you're like, oh yeah, Tommy by comparison, but Dean. But nobody like thought of him as like this strategic threat. They saw him as like a physical threat. And again, I think that what he was unable to do was really articulate what he was able to do throughout the game besides grab a whole bunch of advantages and fit the theme. And that is something that I think, there's a lot of people who I remember at the time who were like, Dean should have won and he fit the season and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, I don't know. Tommy gave the better interview, and you give the job to the person who was the better interview.
Yeah, we went kind of from the theme is not on trial in Edge of Extinction to like the theme doesn't matter in Island of the Idols, which again just goes to show, depending on the cast that's there at that particular time, they might take different things into account. Somebody they did not take into account when it came to their jury votes is Nora, sadly. Yeah. I love Nora. This was clear from the B&Bs that we did during season 39. I am always in love with, in particular, the kooky women that end up showing up on Survivor. And Nora had that in spades, whether it was the mission that she was given by Robin Sandra, I should say, to force herself into the caller position at the challenge and then immediately fail that task and get forced to sit out of the challenge on top of that. Whether it's, her kind of becoming this big wild card and person to rely on, which goes to show just how chaotic that post-merge was. Whether it was like her low-key holding a torch for Detective Dean in the finale when they go on like their little date together. Nora was just an absolute force in this game in terms of personality. And it's so interesting because Carolyn outright says in her preseason press that she is inspired by somebody like Nora, who went out there, was unabashedly herself, and as she encouraged people to do in the Island of the Idols finale, be the cock.
You should always be the cock.
What do you think about?
No,
that's it. That's all your thoughts of Nora in one 3-word phrase.
So what I think is interesting is that I don't think too many people would disagree that I don't think Nora was necessarily any kind of strategic game player. I think that if your production and your casting for season 50 and you're looking for interesting characters, she is obviously going to be in that interesting character list. But I do think that there are other people who probably fit the Nora archetype, but are more strategic, that are more social, that are whatever the case might be. She is somebody though that like I said, or like you said, just the entertainment oozed from her like no other. I found myself like not rooting for Nora in the game, but rooting for her as a person. Like, yes, you awkwardly laugh in the middle of tribal council and ask Jeff what he's looking at you for and like all that stuff. Like you do the,
you freak out and spook Boston Rob when you're told that there's watermelon at the Island of the Idols.
And you know what? The fact that Sandra and Rob can sit in their little hut in the middle of tribal council and have them look at each other and go, like, I love Nora, and not mean it in a mean way, like genuinely, or like, this is somebody who's just like, we can't teach her, but we can't tame her, but also look at her go. She's still in the game and she's still, throwing out wrenches left, right, and center. I think if Nora were able to come into the final tribal council and tie loose ends to her game and speak strategically for the first time really in the game and have it really reach the jury, I really think we could have had a very different vote. Now, I'm not saying that she would have won, but I do think that there's a case in that sense to be made that she is somebody that absolutely should be coming back. But she's such a genuine, original kind of character. And I don't know. I think that she's somebody that is kind of that wild card character. Before we started recording, I told you about a Brant Steele that we ran over on my weekly meltdown, where we did second chances from HHH on. and the theme was heroes versus villains versus vigilantes. She did not make the vigilante cast, but was on the short list of it. And it was because there were other people that we kind of thought, this person is the Nora, but they're maybe more strategic. This person is the blank, but they're maybe like,
and that's the tough thing we have to get into with this particular era of players, is that I think in the old school seasons, we'll be more remiss to be like, yeah, this person probably wouldn't get on over this person, but, we have room, we can throw them on. It's a little tougher. Yes, we have expanded out to 5 slots, but there are more people that are in consideration. And as well, we have to, I think a bit more about, from an archetype, the silos that some of these people are living in, who's kind of on top of them on the silo. And the big one is going to be, I think 9 times out of 10, barring some unforeseen circumstances, you would cast Carolyn on a season over Nora. And
which is what we did.
And it's sad to say, and I would love Carolyn and Nora in the same season just to see what happens when these two atoms smash into each other.
It would be beautiful.
But at the same time, there's only so much entropy and then if you throw other chaotic characters on top of it, as we'll get into with the new era, it may just be too much for production. So that, I will say, is all towards this final 3. This feels to me like a very challenge-coded final 3. Now, I do say that because Tommy himself was on the challenge for a brief portion of time. Unfortunately, it's actually pretty harrowing circumstances. Like, he ends up appearing on Spies, Lies, and Allies, I think it was, and then gets a concussion during a challenge, and, like, he goes through with the rest of it that involves, like, hanging onto a jet ski, but, like, he's so out of it that the torrid rushing waters pull his pants down, and so, like, everyone's kind of laughing at the fact that he's going bare ass in the middle of a daily challenge, but then, like, once he actually gets to shore, they're like, oh shit, he got a concussion, and he gets pulled from the game.
Oh my gosh.
And Tommy has since said that he has retired from reality television. He's gotten married. He actually just recently became a father, so...
Oh, congrats, Tommy.
Yeah, so good for him. He's doing well. His life is fine. And I would say Dean and Nora, and I keep bringing up this circumstance a lot in this era, but I feel like if 40 was an all-star season instead of Winners at War specifically, I think there would be a chance that Nora and especially Dean would have gone on.
Yeah.
Because, like, I don't know if you remember, Beth, but when there was a lot of media stuff going on with season 40, like, Dean, who worked at Google, hosted Jeff Probst, who did this sort of, like, Google talk about the show. Chelsea from this season, who still worked at IMDb at the time, did, like, a Survivor after show for Winners of War. Dean was a guest in the first episode. Like, it was odd because this dude is so quiet in the first few episodes, maybe the most purple person in the cast, but then by the end, Dean Fever was all about. But I wonder if in a season 50 perspective and a 2025 perspective, if that Dean Fever has abated. And he's another example of what you're speaking about, okay, this, like, young, good-looking guy who's good at challenges and was arguably, quote-unquote, robbed in some circles of a win. Are there other people that are more recent examples who would probably take his spot?
And I lean on the yes. I think that that's the case. I think of Xander. I think of people who kind of fit
Charlie to a certain extent.
Yeah. I think that there are people who are going to fit that archetype a little bit more in the modern season. But if they are really looking at, we don't want it just to be, a whole bunch of 41 plus people for 50, and they're trying to figure out who is somebody who fits this archetype, but we're going to have 6 people from 42 and that can't work out. What can we do here? Or 41 or whatever. I really do think Dean should get a look, but I'm not, like, going to stump for Dean in the way that I have other people on this cast that I would be like, if I had to say, if production was like, Beth, you're a deciding person, which, like, Survivor, you're more than welcome to do. Jeff, listen, if you want, feel free to ask me. I will give you plenty of reasons why some of these people, but he is not somebody that I would say when I think of top 5 people from this cast, which is so funny because he is somebody that I do think is quite prevalent in the community still. Like, you still see him showing up to events and you see him actively engaging. And he's, I think that he's a great person for production. But even with that said, I do believe we got to look at the archetypes a little bit. And with this cast having so many strong personalities and people who played the game differently in different ways, like, I don't know. The one thing I would say is a point in his favor is that the 40s have shown us, and I can only assume 50 would be the same way. The production really likes people who play within the theme or what the
Mm-hmm.
advantages and disadvantages are. So if they want someone who's going to play ball with whatever they're going to throw at the contestants, that's a point in Dean's favor because he was like the epitome of that in this season.
Yeah, the one thing I would say about Nora that we haven't already is that, again, I would absolutely love to see her back just because of the character she is.
Yeah.
My concern would be, are there other people, especially in the new era, that would overshadow her? The one thing she does have that someone like Carolyn doesn't is physicality. I believe she's the person who won the most individual immunities that season, including the final individual immunity. She is a health coach. She is a nutritionist. So she is someone who knows how to stay healthy and has been staying healthy before and after her time on Survivor. So I would say to producers out there, if for whatever reason, God forbid, Carolyn does not want to do season 50, have Nora be her understudy and just have her like, hey, if you can't have Carolyn, here's someone that like can fill in some of those cracks and then also has a little bit of some challenge beast in her.
For sure. And I think the other thing, just to make a note too, is like, yeah, I mean, I am not personally, unless it's something that absolutely affects the game. I personally, for the purposes of this exercise, I'm not going to be looking at people's personal politics and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, Nora has had some pretty controversial things to say since her season, especially during the pandemic and being
Mm-hmm.
anti-vax and those kind of things. Which, being a health coach, is like, what are we doing here? But all of that said, I truly do think that she would be somebody who's really interesting. In the same way that we had. Why am I not thinking of her? Debbie. She's kind of a Debbie kind of character for me in a way, where she is kind of inflammatory off the season and in the seasons. But it's at least entertaining on Survivor to a certain extent. But I don't. What I worry with Debbie, which I also worried with Banu, but have not worried with Nora, is that I kind of wonder if sometimes we're taking advantage of somebody's like poor mental health or something when we're watching them. I don't think that's the case with Nora because she was just so full of joy and happiness and like positivity in the way that like I think is so enthralling, especially in a game where you're outside and fighting for immunity and all that fun stuff.
All right, let's move into our jury here, because suffice to say, we have a lot of people to talk about.
Yeah.
So we will not be talking about Dan. Let's talk about the others here. So working our way up, we have, of course, Jack, and of course the person above him who will become, I believe they're now fiancés, in former Olympic swimmer Elizabeth Basil. We have, of course, as you mentioned before, and the unfortunate victim of the sexual harassment controversy in this season, who gets voted out with 2 idols in her pocket in Kellee Kim. We have someone who unfortunately falls for the old trick of finding a piece of paper hanging from a tree and being given no vote automatically, a frequent podcast guest, Jamal. We have the 2 people that go in the split tribal council here in Mr. Kids on His Socks in Aaron, and definitely one of the movers and the shakers up until she ends up going in Missy. We have the first Indian American contestant on Survivor, and to this date, the person who holds the record for most votes against her in a season with 22 in Karishma. We have, of course, the can of biscuits herself and one of Sia's fan favorites in Elaine. We have someone who is tragically taken out by an idol nullifier in the beginning of the finale, and another big fan favorite of the season in Janet Carbin, and our fallen angel in the one, the only Lauren Ashley Beck. Where would you like to start here, Beth? We have a lot of places we can go.
I feel like if we're talking about this season, we have to start with Kellee here.
Okay. Let's I wouldn't say get this out of the way because it's something incredibly important to acknowledge. That, again, Kellee underwent, it was a wild season for her. She gets an idol from the island of the idols. She then uses the idol on Dean, secretly gives him the idol to play it to save him, getting out Jack in the process. She then immediately the next day finds an idol at her swap tribe camp, then merges and finds another idol. And then, due to a lot of the talk in camp at the time and a lot of the women being understandably creeped out by Dan's actions, she believes, okay, the tribe is on my side, we can get rid of him. Sadly, that was not the case, and Kellee is one of only a couple of people in Survivor history to be voted out with 2 idols in her pocket. And Kellee is obviously the center of the reunion, which were very odd circumstances themselves. I ended up attending it. Jeff has this one-on-one sit down with Kellee where he outright says, we were in the wrong to do things like, for example, basically say, hey, if you feel like you're in trouble, you can tell us, rather than the show recognizing and not needing someone who, in a game for $1 million, would not necessarily want to jeopardize, her standing in the game by bringing up a situation that is obviously very dangerous and uncomfortable to her. So he makes that apology to her. And maybe in the moment you could say, like, all right, Kellee is engaging with Survivor. Maybe if the show were to give her a chance, extend her another opportunity to a point you mentioned earlier, she is somebody that would want to play again, and the fans really want to, for a lot of reasons. People felt like she was robbed and her time was cut short under incredibly controversial circumstances. I don't want to put words in Kellee's mouth, but I have been someone that's been, following her on social media since her season aired. And by and large, it does seem like, you talk about people engaging with the community, has largely distanced herself from the show. She is doing fantastic things with her life. I believe she's engaged or maybe even married, which is fantastic. I'm so happy that things are going well with Kellee. But my reading between the lines, and again, I am more than happy to add her on if there's information that comes out after the fact that says, like, no, Kellee's really hungry to play again. My assumption is sort of what I talked about with Zeke during Millennials versus Gen X, which is like, Kellee did an incredible job in the moment and in the aftermath of the show in particular about speaking to the issues at which they were the unfortunate center. But then once that glow kind of faded, she said, you know what, I'm done. I'm going to move on with my life and I don't want to engage with it again.
And I think that's, first of all, more than valid, obviously. Yeah. And I genuinely think that she knows that the fan base would stump for her so much if she wanted it. And I do think that when I was talking in the beginning, I'm sure everybody could see through it, but I was talking about Kellee. Like, if there was one person that production was like, we got to give someone a second chance, it's Kellee. Mm-hmm. But what I don't want is that we got to give Kellee a second chance because of what she went through. Yes, that's a strong reason, but it should be because she also was really good at finding idols. She was a social and strategic threat in this game. She was really, in my mind, until she got voted out, and that she was like, oh, she's going to win. Like, I just think that when I think of people at the late 30s, she is one of the strongest players I think about. And I genuinely think that if she wasn't having to deal with factors outside of the game that also made their way into the game and had people like Missy and Elizabeth who were like playing it up a little bit for strategic reasons, I genuinely think with two idols in her pocket, she doesn't just like go along with everybody. I think that she's able to think and have her head in the game a little bit more. And I also think that if you had some people who weren't going to use such a horrific thing as strategy, that also is something. So I genuinely think that Kellee, to me, is one of the strongest people to play. But I also had the understanding that I was like, I feel like we would have seen her be pretty vocal still about how she wants to play or whatever, or I would have done this in this situation and comment things on Twitter or whatever, like we see some of the other people in this cast and other casts do. So while I would love to have Kellee out there, I agree with you in the sense that I don't believe that she would want to come back. And I can't, first of all, I can't blame her for that for a variety of reasons, but the number one, outside of the whole safety and like kind of reliving trauma portion, outside of that is you right now are like beloved in the community for the circumstances for which you went out and everyone's on your side, but mostly because we all see you as a robbed goddess. There's a real risk of coming back on any show and changing that narrative. And if you are somebody who is inherent implicit trauma with this show and then are coming back, who knows? Do you orchestrate a vote against somebody like, I don't know, like Carolyn or whatever, if Carolyn does come back and people get mad at you or the way that you did that or whatever, like you are kind of putting at risk the little bit of comfort that you do have within this community anyway. So I could absolutely see the argument for her being like, outside of everything, I just don't, I'm kind of happy with how the community views me right now. And I'm good.
Yeah. So again, if people are able to find corroborating evidence that shows that Kellee is someone that would want to come back, then that completely changes my tune. But for now, if what I'm assuming is correct, I am more than happy for Kellee to protect her peace
Yeah.
and, move on from Survivor. I mean, you speak about robbed goddesses, Beth. Let's talk about the other one that people talk about in this season. Let's talk about Janet, someone who I guess technically was voted out with an idol and that she used it and it was immediately returned to sender. But Janet is someone who comes in, the oldest person, oldest woman in the season, I should say, at 59, but immediately proves that she is an asset. She starts fire, I believe, without Flint in the premiere, and then kind of blazes the trail from there. She is, of course, one of the people that does vociferously defend Kellee, turn on Dan, who at that point was one of her closest allies, because of what Kellee was expressing, and as a result becomes a pariah basically in that next round. It basically has to come to Dan like hat in hand, and has to find this idol and play this idol to try to basically save herself. But that is to say that Janet is someone who will scrap like nobody's business. She is somebody who, again, was able to eventually make her way back into the majority to the point that she wasn't necessarily targeted again in a huge way. But still, she knew once she got to the final four, final five, that she was going to be yet another odds-on threat to win. She was an incredible swimmer. She was a lifeguard and a lifeguard coach at the time. So obviously, she had that physicality in spades. And as was shown in that first episode, she can make fire. And so she was giddy in the finale because she had an idol she could play at 5, and then even if she lost the final immunity challenge, she basically has an auto win at fire, and then she'll make the final 3 and she'll probably win. Enter the Uno reverse card that was the coin flip that determined Janet's ouster here. And as a result, people were pretty damn peeved that they had lost one fan favorite in Kellee at the beginning of the merge and another fan favorite in Janet at the end. Janet, if she were to return, would definitely be one of the older people to return from these newer seasons. She would be 65. But as she proved, Beth, from what she was able to do on the island at 59 years old, age is just a number for her.
For sure. I mean, I think that especially when we looked at the 20s and 30s, older women in particular were constantly voted pretty early in the game, if not like the first vote. And because she was able to come in and kind of like throw that archetype a little bit on its head, and because she was somebody who was quite frankly a vote of morality and reason in there, I think people just genuinely felt connected and safe with her in a personal way, as well as in a game sense. Even if they were at odds strategically, I think that they knew that Janet was the type of person that they could at least align with. I think that if you're talking about who the fans would want to come back, who deserves a second chance given everything that happened in this season, and was a strategic or like kind of more of a social and physical threat, Janet is definitely it is there.
Yeah.
She is right now my one of my top people for sure. She is somebody that I know is interested in coming back.
Oh, yeah.
Well. And has, from what I understand, is trying to be very social with everybody who plays the game and that kind of thing. And I do think that she would be somebody that would be a lot of fun to come back and watch. And I think because she is so vocally interested in coming back, that is just something I worry about with her. Is like, is everyone just going to assume that she's just connected to everybody on the cast when they come in and she gets voted out first? Like, is that what's going to happen? But it's Janet, and I don't think that's going to happen. I think that she's somebody that would make great television. She's somebody that I think a lot of viewers at home and people in the cast themselves can see themselves in some aspect. And I think that she's such a solid person to consider coming back from this cast, especially as an older woman. Like, how many people are we really sitting back and being like, oh yes, this person over 50 in general should come back and play and that kind of thing. And the fact that she's somebody that age, I'm not even worried. She could come back as an 85-year-old and I'm like, I know she's swimming those laps in the morning. I know that she's doing that. You know what I mean? I would be totally down to see Janet come back, and I think that she would absolutely jump at the chance to do so.
Completely agree. Let's talk about the person that was voted out before her, did not leave the game, voted out before her in the previous episode. Let's talk about Elaine. This is someone else that also caught the attention of not only the audience, but Sia. Elaine is just, I mean, talk about Nora bringing light, but Elaine is maybe like the sun in that regard. You know, she's a small package, but she contains a big personality, an absolute cut up, someone that has that southern drawl, but always has a one-liner to follow up with. Someone who does have, again, that ability to stick around in the game and be this social force, despite the fact that maybe on paper she looks like someone that could get targeted early, ordinarily in like the 20s and 30s of Survivor. And it gets very much reversed to the point where it gets to a certain extent where everyone basically has to turn on her, saying, we cannot let you get to the end. Everybody loves you. You love everybody. You are going to mop the floor with anybody who sits next to you in the final tribal council. And so Elaine really can't do much in that moment. And they have like a nice little basic like funeral for her as she's sitting there at tribal council, where she knows that she's going and she ends up getting voted out. So I think I would agree that Janet is probably 1A of someone I would expect to see come back from this season. But Elaine is somebody else that I think has a personality that maybe buoys the rest of the way this season is regarded, and could also be a very fun personality to see back on Survivor.
Elaine is the epitome of unifying power. She is somebody that I would love to meet the viewer of this show, because I'm sure it's only one person who didn't like watching Elaine on their television. You know what I mean? Even if you didn't like her strategically or as a game player, you like her as a person. I think with such a season with such heavy storm clouds around it, she was the light beams that burst through those clouds. She was somebody that when she was on screen, if you're watching, you're like, okay, that was really heavy. Okay, Elaine's back. Okay. You just had moments where, as a viewer, you were put at ease even with the heaviness of what's going on. She is somebody that I genuinely think that if production is like thinking about all the different aspects of how to make a cast, yes, I don't think that Elaine is necessarily the most strategic person out there. And I don't think that she is the most physical person out there. But boy, is she social and charming and charismatic. And boy, can she win hearts.
A million hearts?
I think she'll definitely win 1,000,000 hearts. I think she already did that. So she's out.
I think she ended up getting probably close to like 50,000 hearts, I believe, when the Sia money came through.
She got 50,000 hearts, Sia hearts. But I do think that the one thing I worry about with Elaine is like, what more are we going to get? Like, how different will she come back, if at all? And if that is something that is a factor at all in production, like, do they want a repeat of what people did the first time, or they want people who are going to try to take advantage of the game? Because as I'm looking at how production runs season 40 and how Jeff talks about these seasons, they clearly are liking when players try to manipulate what they are doing as production. And they like when people are taking advantage of the twists and things that are being thrown out there. Is Elaine going to be somebody that can play ball with what production is doing? I'm sure she'll have the personality for it, but is she actually going to take control of that in a way that they want to invite her back? That's my question when it comes to Elaine.
I mean, for what it's worth, and listen, basically idols were raining down from the sky in this season, but she does find an idol. I don't believe it ends up really coming to fruition in a major way. She doesn't necessarily play it to like save herself from a majority vote, but she also doesn't need to, where at that point she is firmly well ensconced. So I think she is somebody that would be hungry to play. I mean, you also talk about what has happened to these people since they played last time. Elaine has gotten married since the last time out and has, I think, really solidified her family unit even more than when her then partner ended up visiting her out on the island. And so maybe there's that also idea of Elaine's now doing it for more than just herself. And also, she had said in her quarantine questionnaire, and something that I spoke to her about out there, is that she was in a very odd headspace in Island of the Idol. She had actually just lost her mother. And so she, while maybe it was almost overcompensating the amount of light that she was bringing because she was still kind of grieving it at the same time, I do think that an Elaine 2.0 would bring maybe a clearer headspace to the game, which could be something interesting.
For sure. And when I do say that she's a light of positivity, I don't necessarily mean just because she's upbeat and positive. I genuinely mean because we saw her struggle. We did.
Yeah.
And even through her struggle, the ability to be so vulnerable, transparent, and likable in those moments. I know that when I'm having a moment, I'm not likable. I'm a mess. I'm sure people open their hearts or whatever, but there's something about Elaine that I think player and audience member alone can absolutely say that is somebody who is so genuine to who they are in every single moment that it's hard to distrust them. So I genuinely think that with a clearer headspace coming in, combining that with what we already know about her as a person would be a recipe for just demolishing in a way that I don't think people would expect from her. So that would be really, really fun to see.
But so I should correct myself. Elaine did earn 100,000 hearts from Seer,
Okay.
as well as Janet. And I want to talk about the person who earned 15,000 hearts. Let's talk about Jamal.
Yes.
Jamal has such an interesting story in Island of the Idols, where he gets blindsided in his very first tribal council, where the big storyline was that it was the king, the queen, and the Jack. It was Jamal, it was Molly, and it was Jack. And they blindside Molly because they feel like she's Parvati 17.0 at that point. And Jamal is being personified in that vote as quite cocky, feeling like he's in charge of the tribe. He gets humbled very early. But then the swap happens, and Jamal has this really incredible scene with Jack where he talks about the microaggressive connotations of referring to a buff as a do-rag. And I can't imagine how tough that conversation was, especially because, yes, Under the Idols, if you look at it, was like a pretty diverse cast, and that will obviously become more of the case as the new era develops. But like, I believe Jamal might have been the only Black person on his swap tribe, so to like have that conversation as well, there's a lot that could have possibly, drawn a light onto him in that moment. But instead, he drew a lot of light and love from the community. He was one of these other people who, again, really supported Kellee in the moment, and that sort of leads to, unfortunately, his unceremonious ouster as a result. You talk about someone who's in the community. I think Jamal is one of the people that's most actively involved in RHAP. He has like a near seasonal appearance on the podcast, and I always love it because I won't exactly always agree with what he says, but he has such an interesting way of talking about the game and such an interesting way of expressing it that he's just someone that I want to see talk and hopefully play about Survivor until the end of time.
1,000%. He is somebody to me that has a high level of emotional intelligence in addition to intelligence. He is somebody that I think the best thing that happened to him in the game was getting humbled pretty quickly because it allowed him to kind of take a step back, look at the larger picture, and really start to rely on the things that he does naturally, reading people and trying to connect with them. And I think that having somebody who has been unafraid to talk about something that about microaggressions, about race, that is so entwined with who he is as a person experiencing life. But then if Survivor is a microcosm of society, being able to take the time to say, hey, I want to educate you on this from my perspective and from, I'm sure, a lot of people's perspective, but I don't speak for all Black people, and have that conversation in a way that is accessible to those who may not otherwise have heard that before and not feel like they're being told you're an awful racist and that kind of thing. Not that we should be catering to people in that way, but it gets heard. And he has the ability to do that, which is already a tough conversation to have outside of the game. Having it in the game in front of cameras, it's going to be aired on television, and in a game where anything you do or say could be used against you in a court of trial, tribal council. He is somebody that I think has the strategic mindset, the ability to speak just so emphatically and beautifully that I just think that he is an incredible player. When I think of some of the best players socially and strategically from this cast, he is like, I would say like him and Kellee are 1 and 2 for me. And he was somebody that we cast for our Survivor 50 thing.
Did you cast him as a vigilante?
I cast him as a hero.
Interesting. I mean, I think the way that his game ends, and I think the Sea of Money shows that he is looked back upon as a hero, but before the new era, I think really made edits a bit more complicated. I feel like Jamal was a little ahead of his time, where it was like the beginning and end of his pre-merge were completely different from each other.
I agree. And I think that he's somebody that, like, if he played in the 40s, he would demolish. I think that he's somebody that is not afraid to. He has a bravery about him that I don't think a lot of cast members have, including myself when I've played little games here and there, to just say what you're saying. But he has a way of saying anything and having people listen. They may not agree, but they'll respect it. And that is a huge power to bring into a game like Survivor.
All right, well, let's jump up to our fallen angel in this season, because I want to talk about Lauren Ashley Beck.
Me too.
She's somebody who, I think in comparison to a lot of the characters that we were just speaking about, I don't know if necessarily she's like right up neck and neck with them. You know, Lauren seemed like someone that was incredibly pleasant. She was someone who, at the time, I think was a nanny, but was obviously trying to break into the entertainment industry. So she had those networking skills. She had those interpersonal skills. She was somebody who, if I remember, her Island of the Idols task was that, like, it was choose your champion, basically, that she was supposed to pick someone to win immunity and she would get an idol. And so she ends up picking Nora and, like, convincing everyone, hey, if they offer up food at the next challenge, I think we should all drop out. Yep. And she ends up getting taken out here because she is considered, stop, you've heard this before, Beth, the odds-on threat to win at the Final Four. And so when she doesn't win individual immunity, it's Tommy is able to convince Nora basically like, listen, my fire's not that good, so I'm not going to go against Lauren. Why don't you put Dean in there? And so Lauren falls. Lauren, as much as I speak about Jamal having the biggest presence from an RHAP perspective, Lauren by far has the biggest presence from a Survivor perspective.
Yes.
She's someone that has become almost like synonymous with like the West Coast party of Survivor. She obviously is a huge TikTok presence. She has broken into the hosting industry. And maybe I'm speaking out of my ass here. I do feel like a lot of events that Survivor and even like Bryce and Wen, Survivor adjacent, has done on the West Coast has involved her chiefly in some way, shape, or form.
She is somebody that there's a group of people in my head that are Survivor alums who are like Survivor influencers, so to say. And she is like the top of that, like someone like her or Kelly Wentworth, people who are very, very prevalent and will take it's almost like they take a journalistic approach to influencing in the sense that they'll take, okay, Mike Bloom wrote something, let's talk about it, you know, and like they'll have reactions to things. And Lauren is somebody who I think is opinionated, but from a pretty neutral place when it comes to Survivor. Like, she'll state her opinions, but you can tell that she has that hosting background where she's like, I'll give you some opinions, but they're actually pretty neutral opinions out there. Like, they're not pretty inflammatory. What she's going to do is pick up the things that are maybe a little bit more divisive and say, what do you all think about this? And I think that that's something that would aid her super well if she were to ever come back and play the game. Having that mindset, having that ability to appear like you're saying something, but then when you really think about it afterwards, it's like, well, actually, I think it sounds like other people said something and she was just passing along the information and then kind of putting the ball in our court. Boy, what a good social strategy to do that not a lot of people have the talent and the innate ability to do. She is somebody that I genuinely thought she and Tommy pretty much had similar games, right? Yeah. And I genuinely would have voted for Lauren over Tommy because I felt like she was so much more of a personality in the edit, and she was somebody that I often felt like she was the one creating the plans with Tommy, but she was the one vocalizing them, and he was kind of a yes man and then like would help enact them. I kind of see her more as like the brain instead of Pinky in this situation. And so I think that she's
taking over the Survivor world social media wise.
Exactly. And I just definitely feel like she's taken that brain power and turned it into a survivor empire, so to say, on social media. She is somebody that, if I'm looking from a production standpoint, who is somebody who is still recognizable from this cast, who is a positive influence in the community, would be a dynamic player socially. And I also think has the ability to pull different tricks out of her her purse or whatever throughout the game, I think would be a really fascinating character to watch. And I definitely hope that they consider bringing her back.
All right, well, we fully immersed ourselves in this pool, and now that I'm wet, it's time to talk about Karishma. Let's talk about this. This changes everything.
This changes everything.
Let's talk about Karishma, someone who, I mean, was kind of always the underdog, always the outcast throughout. There's, of course, that's really sad but low-key funny scene in the pre-merge where she, like, cuts her hand and falls in the sand, and, like, nobody gives her the time of day at that point. It just goes to show how people just were not vibing with Karishma. Yeah. The audience certainly was, but the one thing that they were vibing with Karishma was voting for Karishma. Again, She gets 22 votes. She ends up saving herself with an idol one time where she basically nullifies nearly every vote against her during the Elizabeth Tribal Council, but she doesn't really survive out from there. It just gets to a point where the majority kind of gets solidified after Elizabeth goes. Karishma is on the outs, and they decide, all right, yeah, it's finally time for you to go. I adore Karishma so much. Karishma is somebody else that has been very fun in the community. She was in the Survivor Sequester game. I think Lauren was as well. Mm-hmm. Missy and Aaron were in the second one. Karishma is someone who has also, for someone who sort of fell back in love with her husband, self-admittedly, during the loved ones visit. She now has started a family. She has a child and one on the way with her husband. And so Karishma is maybe one of those people you were talking about earlier where it's like, if you put her in another season, I would be really intrigued to see how she does with a different cast.
She is somebody. So first of all, I want to shout out the Survivor Wiki for how they described Karishma as the perennial decoy vote. And I love that so
Before
much.
Q made it cool, there was Karishma.
But it's so funny because I'm happy you brought up the Survivor Sequester game, because I think we have to go back to spring 2020. Her season had not even been done a year. Like it had only been a few months. So she and so many people in this cast were still fresh of mind. They were the last new cast of people. And she came on that game and ate. She left no crumbs. She was a strategic force. She manipulated people left and right. She enacted plans. And it was all of a sudden like, oh, whoa. Now, how much of that is, you're in the comfort of your own home and not in the middle of the island, and you're, now you've come back from the island and you're, re-fallen in love with your husband and all those different aspects, of course, right. But I truly, truly think that if she got any sort of attention that was positive from like an alliance standpoint, I think she genuinely could have done a little better in this season. But now I think coming back, she would be such a threat. And unless people were truly paying attention, I think she'd be completely underestimated. I think a lot of people who don't really know her would sit there and be like, why was she cast? Like, I think a lot of people who were on that cast would potentially completely underestimate her. And as long as somebody was willing to like team up and listen, and she was able to form an alliance, I think that nobody would underestimate her at the end of that season. She is just a joy of a person, and she's intelligent, and she's got a lot of strategy. And we didn't see any of that. And I do think that, again, the elemental aspects of Survivor definitely weighed on her a little bit. And you look at the cast itself, and there's quite a few people that you're like, okay, maybe they had some different morality compasses that I would personally have. But she's somebody that I genuinely was like, there's must be something they're not showing that must have made her on the outs. And I don't know if it's just like, oh, she was somebody that was like constantly homesick or crying or whatever the case might be. And we saw some of that, but not a lot. I genuinely think you come back for a second time and you sure, you're going to experience some of that, but you know how to handle it. You know what to expect this time. If she ever came back, watch out, because I definitely think that it would be such a fun person to have back.
I know that she took a line from Littlefinger that casts as a ladder, but maybe she could be the Daenerys Targaryen of the, exiled
Ooh.
queen returning on Dragonback. I will dote
Here to burn it.
Exactly. I will dote briefly upon the remaining 4 jurors here in Elizabeth, Missy, and Aaron, who sort of became this like very tight trio, only to go out back to back to back in the merge. Jack as well, who ends up becoming linked up with Elizabeth romantically after the show. I mean, I think everyone that we've talked about so far, we're not necessarily at the nucleus of the Dan incident. I think maybe
Right.
the closest is Janet, who obviously was shown in a very positive light going to bat for Kellee, or maybe someone like Lauren, who might have done a little bit of the obfuscating of how they really felt to keep Dan in the game, but certainly not to the extent that Elizabeth and Missy did.
Right.
That being said, if they wanted to come back, I don't think the show would let them come back. I think it's very much a like, if we are going to try to step aside people remembering this issue as much as possible, we are not bringing back anyone who did the most controversial things besides Dan. On top of that, Elizabeth has seemed to very much move on with her life. She was actually in Tokyo commentating on Olympic swimming. We'll see if she does it this time with Paris. Missy was on, God, it was a CW show that I'm going to have to look up. She was on a reality TV show recently, but she even said in her quarantine questionnaire back in 2020 when asked if she would come back, she just kind of glibly said, like, hall brawls are more my speed. So I think whether it was the social media backlash or what she did out on the island, she was ready to move on. Jack seems like a sweet guy, but he was a little bit of a sort of like a non-character in comparison to all these other people that I don't think he'd get a call back. Aaron would even admit that he said some very stupid things out on the island, namely basically saying, well, if anybody was really having a problem with Dan, I would have known about it. He has come forward, luckily, after the season to admit that, like, he was absolutely mistaken and that he shed a bit more light with me, I remember, as to, like, what the talk production gave with them during the merge was all about and how that left him in a confused state where he wasn't necessarily informed the extremity of everything that was happening. And so I do think that while Aaron does have regrets, obviously, for his behavior over the course of the season, I feel like his association, on top of the fact that there are people that have come afterwards that sort of fill that, again, challenge beast, even dad challenge beast archetype, leaves Aaron off the ballot here.
For sure. And if there's one thing I could actually do to give Aaron, not credit for like Survivor 50, but just in general, I actually do think it's really important that we saw somebody on the cast who was like, if there was a problem, I would know about it and have some of those inflammatory remarks and then come back, learn, and both apologize and grow.
Mm-hmm.
Because Aaron is but one of so many people, especially men, who are more likely to invalidate an experience because they feel like they would know or they feel like something blah 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 blah. And I do think that in a weird, awful kind of way, it's an important reminder that we need to validate if people say this is how they're feeling or what their circumstances or experiences have been. It's not our job to invalidate that, but how do we show up to validate and support them, even in a game like Survivor? And actually, if you can do that in your real life, going into Survivor and playing that up strategically. Oh, so that person said that about voting you out. Ooh. Like not invalidating that, but playing along with it. It's actually going to help you. I'm not saying that as a means of being like, yes, Aaron should come back. Cause I really don't think so. I think I agree with you. I think there's so many other people that fit his archetype better. And I do think that production is going to want to stay away from anybody who they felt like made any kind of waves on this season that were negative in nature. But I do just also want to say for the record, like, if you are somebody who has ever been called out, not just on national television, on social media, but just in general, like if you are somebody who's been called out for saying something inflammatory or inappropriate or had a microaggression or whatever the case is, the best thing that you can do is listen, learn, apologize, and move on. And I think that, that's an important, in a weird way, important representation that we got from him on this, if you followed him after the season too.
Well said.
I think the last thing just to say about Jack and Elizabeth in particular is that there's no way that production's going to want to bring them back after they didn't come. They broke the rules for the reunion.
That's very true. Yeah, they did not go to the reunion. They said long hair don't care about showing up. I'll also say Missy was on Fight to Survive, which was a CW reality show. She made it all the way to finish as the runner-up, and she was alongside Libby and Gonzalez from Ghost Island. So
oh, wow.
It was a very random show. Well, let's move into, and I know
we're running. Quit it when that was around.
Yeah, we're running long on time, but I think unfortunately this pre-merge group, I think just because the jury is so chock full of characters, between Jason Linden, our first ever Canadian, advertised Canadian contestant. I know that Todd was technically a dual citizen, but Tom Laidlaw, ever since they opened the casting to Canadians, was the first one to appear on there. We have Chelsea Walker, the super fan that worked so hard to get onto the show and was blindsided with an idol in her pocket. Vince, who was such a fun character, did the mission where he had to go undercover at the other camp to steal fire to find an idol that he got voted out with. We have the aforementioned Molly, the queen of Vokai, that got overthrown. And we have the poker player, Ronnie, who gets blindsided at the first vote. Ronnie has said afterwards that actually he was not doing well from a medical perspective well. So it seemed like he just had a really rough time out there. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, Beth, but I would imagine between, again, how stacked the jury and finalists are, and between the fact that maybe some of these players would get, again, replaced by people that fill their archetype that went further in future seasons, who from this cast, if you had a blank piece of paper like the one Jamal found, would you want to bring back from the pre-merge?
Honestly, for me, it's between Chelsea or Jason. I do think that Jason had a little bit more agency in the game and was kind of involved with some strategy, which was great to see. And I think that Chelsea had, I'm trying to remember, she was on the Lyro tribe.
Yeah. It was that women's alliance that in reality wasn't actually a women's alliance, but we were led to believe that there was one. And then Missy all of a sudden just turns everything onto Chelsea.
I really think that if Chelsea played with a different cast, I think that she would have a pretty good run. But to the exact point that you've said before, I would rather, instead of seeing a Chelsea, I'd rather see, Lauren from Island of the Idols come back, or somebody who fits that archetype. And I just don't think that there's anybody from this pre-merge that I think I'm going, oh, robbed goddess in the pre-merge or robbed god, let's do this. And there's nobody that I am particularly memorable in the sense that, oh yeah, they're going to be on the top of that list for Survivor 50.
Yeah, I mean, Vince is such a really fun personality. He was one of my favorite people to interview out there on the island because he was just so unique. I think he was the first contestant of Hmong descent as well, and so he brought that uniqueness to it, again, especially in a pre-diversity era initiative. But yeah, I think, unfortunately, this is a case where we can't be as liberal with our choices of bringing on pre-mergers for this particular season when we have 20 people, well, 19 technically, to choose from. And again, the top half of the cast is just so stacked.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
All right. Well, then, Beth, on that note of that stacked group, we got to do this here. Now, let's make this streamlined here because you were super efficient. You came in with a ranked list.
I did.
How about you give your top 5, I give my top 5, and then we'll sort of start with the common ground and work from there.
Okay. So, 5th to 1st. I don't know.
Oh, I love this. Making it a climactic.
My 5th person was Karishma.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that she would be a lot of fun. But I don't think that she's as on top of the list for production as other people. My 4th was Lauren, Ashley Beck. My 3rd was Jamal.
Mm-hmm.
My 2nd was Elaine, and my 1st was Janet.
Where's the match game sound? Because those are my 5 too, Beth.
Hey!
Is it that easy?
Here's the thing. If Kellee were wanting to come back, she would be my number 1. But I just genuinely have never gotten the sense she wanted to come back.
Yeah, so I agree. And again, we have the wild cards. If people make cases for her or even a case for someone like Dean or Nora, who I think would be like a 6, 7, I would definitely be up for it. But we can only choose 5. in this podcast, and I am in total agreement for all the reasons we mentioned before. So added onto the list today are Lauren Ashley Beck, who is 34, Janet Carbin, who is 65, Elaine Stott, 46, Karishma Patel, 42, and Jamal Shipman, 39. What's interesting is it's basically like the last 4 people voted out and then Jamal.
I love that. And again, I mean, if Kellee wanted to play or whatever, you would have like 2 people who went in the very early jury, if that was the case. But I think it's a fascinating season in that I'm looking at the top 3 and going, I think that there's other people, but the theme of this season was, you're too big of a threat to the brink of the end, so we're going to cut you now.
Very new era.
Very new era. This, honestly, I don't think that people think about Island of the Idols a lot like the 40s, but I think it really set the tone for the 40s.
All right. Well, last but certainly not least, Beth, and maybe some of these cast members have already done our job for us, but yes, who from this cast would you want to see on another reality show? I maybe put the cart before the horse when I said that the final 3 felt very challenge coded, and maybe Nora is a little bit on the older side for a new challenge cast member, but I feel like this is a show that is made for her, right? Like, you get to get into like wild arguments with people and do kooky physical challenges. That sounds like Nora's wheelhouse.
I would like to see Nora on Drag Race as somebody that you have to like make over for a challenge.
Oh, and then she like wanders off from the chairs like, oh, look at this brush.
Yeah, I think it'd be so fun. You had to know that I was going to bring up Drag Race at some point. Like, I'd be like, oh yeah, it'd be really great to see like Dean in drag and have him like on whatever.
Now Dean in drag, and then he'd have to de-drag.
He could be Dean drag. I don't know. No, but I when I'm thinking about this cast, I think you're right when you're saying pretty challenge coded in that sense. But I do think having someone like Elaine in the Big Brother house would be a lot of fun.
Oh, and it, like, how many boxes does it check, right? Because
right.
They love the Southern stereotype. And not to say that Elaine is necessarily that, but she kind of has the accent where she could feed those lines that she'd be able to give of like, oh man, I feel worse than a biscuit at 400 degrees in the oven after 20 minutes.
And on top of that, I mean, somebody who would be fun to watch from a feeds perspective. The only thing that I worry about is, what didn't we see on the island that we will now see with live feeds, as long as they still have live feeds in whatever season?
As someone who got to witness Elaine in the first few days, it's going to be a lot of stories. Again, when I visited the Lyro camp, she was doing stand-up, basically. Like, the Lyro tribe wasn't doing anything. They weren't working. They were just all sitting in the shelter, and Elaine was just telling a bunch of jokes about what they were going to tell Jeff Probst when they saw him for the first time. So
that's amazing. And I stand, because that's exactly what I would be like in any situation. It's like, Beth, we're in the middle of Survivor, in the middle of a challenge. Well, you better believe I'm going to pull out the Christian Hubicki. Like, let me tell you everything about Pokemon or whatever. And then at camp, I'm going to be the one who's like, let me tell you this stupid story I have. Like, but it would be, I think that having someone like her makes the feeds fun. And so I don't know if she's up for it. If she's up for, near 100 days in a house away from her partner and spouse, then go for it.
All right. Well, tomorrow, Beth, much like we were doing in the viewing of Survivor 39 at some point, we are looking ahead to Survivor Winners at War. And again, it's a returnee season, so we're doing things a little bit differently. Instead of adding people to the ballot, it's going to be myself and Rob looking at the cast of Survivor Winners at War. And look, that was a very unique season, considering there was one specific piece of criteria we had to pull from. But I think in particular, we're going to look at, okay, who were they looking at, and what was the shakedown of quote-unquote old school versus new school? And as the last full returnee season before Survivor 50, what can we learn from it? So it should be a really good time. Make sure you don't miss out. Yeah, exactly. Before we take our fire tokens and push them all into the new era, and we finally move into that. But Beth, thank you. We bid adieu to really old school Survivor, the old era, as people remember it, and look ahead to what's to come. And it was a very high bar here to talk about a season that deals with some incredibly serious circumstances, but try to not necessarily come in saying, screw them all, there's no one to bring back from this season. And I think you did a really nice job of obviously vocalizing a lot of incredibly important things that happened in this season, but also making the case for why there is a considerable group of people that could and maybe should be given a second chance at the game.
For sure. And I do think that, again, it's hard to separate the things that happen that are controversial because they do impact the game. But if you're able to separate people out and kind of look at who they are and how they maneuver the game, obviously we won't know what they were like from a production standpoint. I know that that's probably a consideration that production has that we don't have insights to. But I just genuinely think that Island of the Idols and Edge of Extinction in particular were kind of at the time very much viewed as a rough ending to the 30s. And I genuinely think that for different reasons, if you were to look at the cast themselves of who was there, it would be amazing to see so many of those different people within the context of different returning players.
All right. Well, Beth, you mentioned it before, but I believe at the time this is being released, the finale of Drag Race All-Stars 9 will have aired. So what would you like to plug for everybody out there?
Yes. So I do think that right now we are considering, it's not a set thing, but Aman and I might cover Global All-Stars together.
Ooh.
So if you are not currently following the Drag Race feed, make sure that you do so, because we may surprise you with a whole other season. 3 back-to-back, baby. Let's go. But you can also catch me on My Weekly Meltdown. I typically take a little bit of a step back for Big Brother. I kind of save all that energy for RHAP. But they are doing great stuff, and we typically do really silly, stupid podcasts over there. And you can follow me on all my social media at AugustaWind11.
Well, thank you for bringing the wind to this podcast. It felt like a breeze to do with you, Beth.
Thank you. I'm such a fan.
All right. Well, tomorrow we'll be getting into a fan favorite season in the form of Survivor Winners at War with Rob Cesternino as we make the jump into the new era. Thank you all so much for listening. Let us know your thought on who else from Island of the Idols you want to see back, or your thoughts on the people we put on the ballot. Until next time, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.